Well, who is or was Hermes Trismegistus? Simplest answer to that is a direct negation. He wasn't. No such guy. Never existed. Well, lots of people believed otherwise. Let's go back 5.5 centuries to late 15th century Florence. Now, this is a city that is the kind of cultural and artistic cradle of the Rinascimento, the rebirth, the Renaissance of ancient cultures. And one of the people who was active in one important aspect of that was a philosopher named Marsilio Ficino. Ficino was part of the court of the first really powerful Medici ruler of Florence, Cosimo de' Medici, who in his old age, he was figured rightly in the 1460s that he didn't have too long to live. Cosimo got hold of a manuscript brought from what had been Constantinople, which was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in, what was it, 1453, excuse me. And there was a rush of refugees during the latter part of the 1450s from Constantinople into Western Europe, including learned scholars bringing with them manuscripts, including the full Greek text of the Dialogues of Plato and the full Greek text of philosophical dialogues attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. Now, Cosimo got his hands at more or less the same time on both of these manuscripts, and he said to Ficino, Marsilio, I'd like you to translate this stuff, because I can read Latin, but I can't read Greek, and you're pretty good at Greek. But he said, I'd like you to translate the most important stuff first, because, I'm not looking forward to too many more years on this planet. Translate Hermes Trismegistus first. So in 1463, that's what Marsilio Ficino set out to do. It didn't take him too long, because the manuscript of dialogues that he had was quite short. The Pimander of Hermes Trismegistus, that was the title that Ficino published it under, was printed for the first time in 1471, and it was a massive bestseller. 1471 is very early in the history of printing, by the way. Anything printed before 1500 is described as an incunabulum, a product of the cradle of printing. So among the incunabula of the 15th century are Ficino's various writings and translations, including his translation first of Hermes Trismegistus, and then subsequently of the Dialogues of Plato. This was the first Latin translation of all of Plato. Up to that point, Western Europe had one or two, or perhaps several dialogues in Latin, notably the Timaeus, and a couple of shorter ones. And that was it. They knew Plato basically by reputation, and through scattered bits of translation that had come through the Arabic world during what the Renaissance was the first to call the Middle Ages. Guess what? Nobody in the Middle Ages said, hey, here we are in the Middle Ages. It was when people decided that they valued the ancient cultures of Greece and Rome a lot more than all the centuries that lay between them and the decline of those cultures, that they began to speak of the Middle Ages as this long middle era that separated them from what they really wanted to get at. Now, let me show you something here. I don't know if the camera can pick it up. It says Corpus Hermeticum. This fat volume. You may wonder why I've got it wrapped in brown paper. That's so that when I sit on the subway and leaf through the pages of the Corpus Hermeticum, I don't get attacked by mobs of occultists chanting Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes Trismegistus. Okay, that's a bit silly. I'll tell you something even sillier, which is that I possess one of the very few manuscripts of Ficino's translation of the Corpus Hermeticum in Canada, one of the very few. You think, well, that must be pretty precious, a manuscript of a text translated in 1463 and first printed in 1471. Wow, Michael. And you'll be a little less impressed when I confess that the manuscript is written in ballpoint pen. I made that transcription myself, in fact, about 40 years ago in a library in France from a 1532 edition of Ficino's translation, which was, of course, not to be photocopied as a precious text, precious edition. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about this Hermes Trismegistus guy, who excited people. Well, Ficino was excited because when he read this text, the first dialogue, the Greek title of it is Poimandres. He Latinized it as Pimander. It's a creation story, and it's written by this ancient Egyptian figure who had the reputation of being a great philosopher, a great king, a great priest. That's what Trismegistus means, 3 times great. And Hermes, well, Hermes, that's the name of the one of the Greek gods, isn't it? Also sometimes Latinized as Mercurius, Mercury. So here's something from an ancient Egyptian. And when you read through these dialogues, if you've also been reading Plato, as Ficino had, there's a lot of stuff that chimes and echoes and resonates. And so Ficino, having been told that this stuff was a lot older than Plato, thought, bingo, this is where Plato must have got a lot of his stuff. He learned it through a chain of transmission originating with Hermes Trismegistus. So how ancient was Hermes? Well, when you read the Poimandres, the first dialogue of the creation story in this body of texts known to modern scholars as the Corpus Hermeticum, you notice there are resonances with the creation story in the book of Genesis. Okay, who was Moses? Well, Moses actually is a clearly Egyptian name, and the story of Moses is the story of a young Hebrew child who was adopted by the Egyptian royal family and became learned in all of the arts of the Egyptians, according to texts which by Jewish tradition and Christian tradition, of course, when they were adopted as the Old Testament. The first 5 books of the Old Testament were purportedly written by Moses himself, even though he's dead before the end of the 5th one. Minor problem. So if Hermes' texts look like being the source of Plato, is it possible they could also be a source for the writings attributed to Moses? Well, why not? Some differences in the Genesis creation story. Of course, it's a story of differentiation between human and divine, and the great transgression of Adam and Eve is to eat the apple, the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge, which the serpent has told them will make them effectively divine. So their transgression is attempting to recross the division between creator and created, between the God who made the cosmos and humankind who were made out of dust, that being the root meaning of Adam. In contrast, the story in the Poimandres, the first tractate of the Corpus Hermeticum, is a story of a divinity, a primordial man, not woman, a bit sexist, this stuff, who, having seen what the divine father, the chief god, has created, says, I'd like to go and create something myself. And he's given permission. And so he descends through the planetary spheres that separate the earth, the newly created earth, from the super celestial realm where divinity resides. And as he descends to the earth, he sees his own reflection in the waters of nature. And of course, he's a divine being, transcendently beautiful. Nature, who is feminized, smiles up at him. And he's rather taken by, in effect, his own reflection, and descends into nature and comes to cohabit with nature, and effectively that's the fall of mankind, that he comes to inhabit a form devoid of reason, carente ratione, if I'm not mangling the Latin of Ficino's translation. And so the project of the Hermetic texts is, how can human beings descended from this primal man come to know what they truly are, come to recognize the spark of divinity within them, and return through a state of purgation and self-knowledge to the originary divine condition of man. So that's a pretty brief explication of the one minute aspect of the content of these texts. There's a huge sort of penumbra of magical, astrological texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. But a key message is this notion that human beings are potentially divine and can return to that divine state, but they have within them a capacity that one of the Hermetic dialogues, the Asclepius, refers to as a sort of self-fashioning. In this sort of secondary reflection on the creation story, God creates the cosmos and then creates humankind, but has occupied every little space in the sort of chain of being, the scale of being, from angelic to inanimate, with various creatures, and there's no particular place left for the man that he's created. So God says to Adam, you can be what you want to be. I give you the power to become, to occupy whatever place in this chain of being pleases you. You can descend into your animal nature, you can become bestial, or you can ascend into being a kind of angelic form, or you can penetrate the very center of your own being and become effectively divine. So that's the kind of occult knowledge, occult simply meaning hidden, that became part of, well, in the wake of Marsilio Ficino, it was pretty mainstream in Western European philosophical thinking. Hermes Trismegistus is commonly named as sort of one of the first, maybe along with Zoroaster, one of the originators of philosophical, theological, theosophical thinking in the tradition that Western Europeans knew about.
So in effect, you could say that he's the one that makes the first creation story of that sort of Greco-Roman tradition, and or at least one that's grabbed a hold of by the people in the Renaissance who essentially invent a Europe that goes on to basically conquer the world.
Yeah, I mean, it was of course somewhat risky to say outright, oh, I think Moses got his stuff from this Egyptian guy. That could get you in trouble with the church. So people who do say that tend to be the wild-eyed Hermetists rather than the ones who are angling for promotion within the church hierarchy. But one central issue seems to have been the fact that late medieval philosophy was tending to put a lot of things in doubt. I mean, it was based largely on Aristotelianism, and for Aristotle, creation stories for Aristotelians rather, creation stories like that of the Book of Genesis are a little bit hard to reconcile with the principles that late medieval thinkers were drawing from the philosophical traditions they knew. So there was a kind of tendency for a split between the truths provided by reason and the truths handed down by faith. And Hermes Trismegistus provided a kind of magical answer to the problem. Woohoo, here's someone who appears to be the kind of headwater of both theological and philosophical traditions. So they can't really be divergent if they come from the same source. Now, one of the entertaining features of the Hermetic text, should be wiping my face with my fingers, should I? Excuse me that. Is that the texts are written in Greek, but pretend to have been written in Egyptian. There's one text that goes on at some length about how this text must never be translated from the sacred language of the Egyptians in which it is written into the depressingly ordinary language of the Greeks, because words have power in this sort of magical language that it is written in, and the texts will lose a great one whole side of their meaning if anyone translates them, which is of course BS, because one can very quickly discover in the texts, in the Greek text, of formulations that are indebted to not to anything Egyptian, but to a fairly late version of Platonism. So the texts are trying to play a kind of game with their readers, which, can I go? Shall I? We okay? Anybody still awake? I hope not by this point. They're trying to play a kind of game with the readers because this usurping tendency, the pretense that something written in Greek was really written in a sacred hieratic Egyptian language, can, if you like, go back to the personage of the supposed author. Hermes in Greek is an obvious parallel to the Egyptian god Thoth, or Thut, or Theudas, who he becomes in one of Plato's dialogues. Thoth is the secretary of the gods, the moon god, secondary to the supreme god Amun-Ra, but has a tendency even in Egyptian thinking to be a kind of usurper. The scribe kind of takes over the functions of the authentic, originary, higher divinity. And you can see that in the Hermetic texts, where Hermes has a son whose name, Tat, is obviously derived from Thoth, or Thut, and also has a disciple whose name is Ammon. So Ammon has been demoted from the sun god to a mere sort of royal still, but a mere disciple of Hermes. Now, of course, the other joke is it should be obvious by now, that there never was such a person as Hermes Trismegistus. And when Greek scholarship reached a level of linguistic sophistication that enabled European scholars to distinguish between different dialects of classical Greek and different historical sort of periodizations within the language, in the same way as we can fairly easily tell the difference between 20th century English text and a 17th century English text. There are all kinds of clues everywhere. Once, by the late 16th century, European scholars were able to do that. They very quickly could identify, well, they could identify specific texts that were being echoed or plagiarized or cribbed in the Hermetic dialogues that were supposedly many, many centuries earlier. And it became obvious that the Hermetic texts dated probably from a period between possibly as early as the 1st century before the Common Era up to probably about the 3rd century, Anno Domini, if you wish, or 3rd century Common Era. So, and of course, Hermes as a singular person clearly didn't exist as the author of this really quite disparate body of texts. So by the mid-17th century, anybody who was kind of up to date in their scholarship knew that the Hermetic texts were not authentically what they claimed to be. People could still continue to say, well, there's got to be a lot of ancient wisdom encoded within them, so I'll still value them. By the 18th century, Hermes Trismegistus was a kind of joke. There's one of the early great novels in English was written by the clergyman Lawrence Sterne in the 1760s, and it's the story of it's the despairing autobiography of a man named Tristram Shandy, whose life has been a complete shambles. And one of the early things that goes wrong in his life occurs when he is christened. and his father sends an urgent message from one wing of his country house to the other, where the christening of this moribund infant is taking place, and the chambermaid is told the name of the child is to be Trismegistus, because that is auspicious and he will have a great life. And she mucks it up, and all she can remember by the time she gets to the priest is Tris, and the priest says, "Oh, Tristram, yes, okay," which is a definitely non-auspicious name. So maybe we'll stop there.